Welcome once again, brothers and sisters, to another message from the Church of God Seventh Day. This morning, the message today will be titled, A Cupbearer's Will. This is a message about the story of Nehemiah and who he was and what he had done with his life. In the first chapters of the book we're going to go over, it talks about how Nehemiah was a cupbearer for the king. And in doing so, he's seen, what his people were going through, because he was in a high position. He knew all around what he was going through. But in this, he knew that he had to do something for his people. And this time, it was just before the people started returning back to Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity. So Nehemiah knew what he had to do. And he knew, being a child of God, he had to do something fast. Just like us in our lives. We know we see destruction all around us sometimes. We know we see the failing of people sometimes. That we must do just as Nehemiah did. And hopefully we will learn something from this message, and we'll get something from it. We're going to start our study in Nehemiah at the end of chapter 1. And in verses 8 and 9, he explains, how he prayed. This was his prayer. And he told, God that of what Moses had said. About, if you are, he said, an unfaithful nation, pretty much, God will scatter you among the nations. And in verse 9, he also points out, but if you return to me, if you come back to me and keep my commandments, not only keep them, but do them, it says. Though some of you were cast out from the farthest parts, it says, from the furthest of destruction, from the furthest casting of out, yet I will gather them from there. Even from there, he will still bring them back. Even how far you are in what you think that you're going through, God will still bring you back, he says. And in verse 10, we're going to read that, and it says, Now these are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and your strong hand. This right here, we see faith, brothers and sisters, in God's great power, that Nehemiah had. He knew how grand and great God's power was. That's why he knew he had to make this proclamation to God for his people. Let's remember, like I said, who Nehemiah was. He had a heart for his people. And we see that right there in just the prayer alone. Later on, we're going to see how he had a heart for his country. And in doing the work of God, he had a heart for his God. And let's go on to chapter 2, and it says, And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. He always did his job right. He was in a position to do his job. He said he had never been sad in his face before of the king. So this tells me that he was doing the best job he could for the king. He knew what he had to do in his position. And verse 2, it says, Therefore the king said to me, Why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart. So what did he do? He became dreadfully afraid, it says. This was respect for the king he had showed him. He had never been sad in his face before, nor did he want to be. But he had to be in this certain situation. This is a bad situation. He knew his people needed him. And verse 3, it says, And said to the king, May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad, when the city, the place of my father's tomb, lies waste, and its gates? And burn, it says, and burn with fire. This was the heart for his country that we spoke of. He knew he had a heart for his country, what he had to do. And verse 4, it tells us, what the answer to a lot of our problems, what I believe we need to do. Then the king said to me, What do you request? And what did he say? Before he even said a word, what did he do? So I prayed to the God of heaven. Before he even answered a word back to the king, he prayed about it for God to guide him. And he said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tomb, that I may rebuild it. This was him, brothers and sisters, sacrificing his lifestyle. He was giving up the king's lifestyle. He knew he was in a great position where he was at. He was very comfortable living where he was at. But he knew he had to leave all that behind. He had to sacrifice all that to do the will of God, to do what God wanted him to do. He knew he had to give up that comfortable lifestyle. Let's go on to verse 10. And it says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite officially heard of it, they were deeply disturbed. They said they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. This is the enemy's criticism again already first coming upon them when they see the work of God beginning to proceed from the people. He heard about it, they said, only just to hear about it. Not only did they even see it yet, they just heard what was going to happen. And they were already deeply disturbed. And in verse 11 it says, so I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. So it didn't happen immediately, brothers and sisters. It didn't happen immediately. He had to wait 3 days. You know, this is that patience that we need too with the works of God. We need to take time to let things happen in God's time. You know, how long was Jesus in the tomb? 3 days. It didn't happen immediately. It has to take time in God's time.